shifted several times. The latest incarnation of it, he's saying he wants to buy 1,900 lots owned by the city for $3,000 each, which would bring a little more than $500,000 into the city coffers, which for a major city, that's no money. But now he wants to plant hardwood trees. So he's kind of backed off the agricultural thing and wants to plant hardwood trees. So the mayor's office announced a couple of months ago, and this was the same incident that I said the woman called me and she wanted to meet all of a sudden. It was because of my criticism of the mayor's office over this incident. So a few months ago, maybe 2-3 months ago, the mayor's office announced publicly, there was a big thing in the newspaper, that they had brokered a deal with John Hance to sell him 1,900 lots. And so we're looking at this like, huh? No. So we did two things. We started a community campaign to just straight up oppose it. A lot of us just opposed to it for several reasons. But then we also, because I'm a member of the Food Policy Council, I was able to get them to hold a public listening session. Not to come out and oppose it, but to create a forum so people in Detroit could come out and say what they think and what their experiences have been with trying to buy land. And so we found that individual growers who might be trying to buy the lot next door to them don't have the same ease that has been given to John Hance, who's trying to buy 1,900 lots. And so something's wrong with that picture. We need a fair, just system and transparent system that's, where everyone goes through the same process. The other problem we have with this proposed sale to John Hance is that typically when the city sells large swaths of land, they enter into what's called a development agreement. The development agreement specifies how the land will be used. They wanted to bypass that general procedure and sell him the land using what's called a purchase agreement, in which he would not have to specify how the land would be used. So for now he could decide, well, I don't want to do trees. I'm putting up a strip mall or whatever he might decide to do. And so we thought that was problematic. But we also think that it's problematic to continue to sell large swaths of land to wealthy white men. And in fact, just leading into my response to Santiago's question, I would say that that's one of the major problems in the world and one of the major reasons for food security in the world, that we have white men who have a lot of wealth that they have accumulated, often intergenerationally through the exploitation of others, who own the majority of the land, and others are dispossessed of their land, and you cannot have food security if you don't have access to land. You end up dependent upon somebody else for your food source. And so this has been a very deliberate scheme throughout the world, which is tied to imperialism and colonialism and the vestiges of those systems. So anyway, this is something I wrote for the blog called Land and Power. In the mid-1970s, I was a member of the Detroit-based Pan-African Congress USA, inspired by the South African political party, the Pan-Africanist Congress. The PAC USA asserted that land is the basis of power. Of course, this slogan echoed the words of Malcolm X and countless other black activists before him. It embodied the understanding that it is from the land that we get the food that sustains our lives. It is from the land that we get the minerals needed for housing. It is from the land that we get the materials needed for housing and clothing. It is from the land that we get the mineral resources that feed economies and generate wealth. It is on the land that we build, grow, and create community. As we struggle to foster food security, food justice, and food sovereignty, the question of land, who so-called owns it, who controls it, and who benefits from it must be in the forefront of our discussions. Many forces have shaped the past 700 years of human history, but none as profoundly as the global imperial expansion by England, France, Spain, Portugal, and Germany. The centuries-long conquest, colonization, enslavement, domination, and exploitation of Africans and other people of color in their lands was deeply rooted in a white supremacist worldview. European explorers came to the shores of West Africa and the east coast of what we now call the United States with ideas about the private ownership of land that was shaped by the feudal societies that they came from. Highly stratified societies where the wealthy owned much of the land and the masses were landless, impoverished, and subject to all manner of abuse and exploitation. Those European explorers encountered Africans and so-called Native Americans whose cultures suggested that the earth cannot be privately owned, but only wisely used by humans for the common good and preserved for future generations. Because Europeans eventually won the hard-fought military campaigns they waged against Africans and other indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere and created institutions to maintain their cultural dominance, we have been taught the idea that the earth is a commodity that can be bought and sold. This idea has continuing impact. Many contemporary national boundaries are the result of colonization by Europeans. We can't intelligently discuss the economic, political, social, and health disparities impacting Africans both on the continent and in the diaspora without understanding how these inequities were shaped by and continue to be perpetuated by European imperialism, colonialism, neo-colonialism, that's what the house Negroes he was talking about, and the global system of white supremacy. Across the planet, this thirst for continued dominance plays out in land grabs. More and more land ownership, so-called, is being concentrated in the hands of a few. Smallholder farmers are being forced out of business. People leave rural areas to come to cities where if they find employment, they become wage slaves to the wealthy. Land grabs are taking place in many African American communities, such as Harlem, Washington, D.C., and Detroit. But Detroit is unique. The population of Detroit declined from 2 million in 1950 to 713,000 in 2010. The city government struggles with how to maintain city infrastructure and services for a geographic footprint which has not shrunk with the meager resources afforded by a much smaller tax base. No easy task indeed. With more than 1/3 of the city's land mass vacant, Detroit is a prime target for land grabbers. One can clearly see the temptation facing city government to sell off unused land, unused city-owned land, to the highest bidder, putting the land back on the tax rolls and in the process ridding themselves of the responsibility of cutting the grass and otherwise maintaining the property. But this is not the time for easy solutions. This is a time for bold, innovative thinking that is informed by history and guided by the values that work for the betterment of humanity. Because Detroit is viewed by many around the world as the poster child for urban decay, there is great interest in our efforts to think, create, and build ourselves out of this seemingly intractable situation in which we find ourselves. The eyes of the nation are on Detroit. Detroit's political leadership has the opportunity to shift the paradigm from more concentrated ownership of land in the hands of wealthy whites to strategies that recognize the value and development potential of commonly held land and the value of facilitating increased land ownership by the city's residents. Besides for its people, land is Detroit's most valuable asset. Detroiters should ask our political leadership the following 5 questions. 1, how can fair, just, and transparent procedures for the sale of city land be developed and implemented? 2, how can a development strategy be implemented that allows for commonly held land to be entrusted to city residents for beautification, recreation, gardening, environmental stewardship, teaching, and generating income? 3, how much land should be sold to any one developer or consortium of developers? 4, what reciprocity should the people of Detroit expect for the sale of public land to developers? And 5, how do we close the historical gap between wealthy landowners and the landless? If the people of Detroit do not quickly learn the lesson taught by the Pan-African Congress USA, that land is the basis of power, we will find ourselves in a continuing subordinate position. So that's my view on the land situation.